Welcome back to our series of Angular I/O tutorials. Today we're going to be building a template-driven form. Now, template-driven forms are one technology that Angular offers for building a form. They emerge from the HTML piece of the template. And if you've done model view controller templates, then it's going to be technology that's more familiar to you. It takes a very traditional approach. The major pieces coming out of the template itself. The other technology that Angular offers for building forms is called reactive forms. And in that, the form emerges more from the TypeScript file, more code-driven, more active, more reactive, as its name suggests. Both are important for building your career, and if you consider what production applications are built up of in the front end, it's a lot of forms. In either case, you've got to get good at building and using forms to develop a career as a front-end developer. Forms, regardless of framework, are going to build on the existing HTML methods of writing forms. Those are well established. They've been around for a long time. So if you haven't studied HTML forms in depth, you're going to find that as a barrier if you just try to push it on the Angular side. So make sure you look at how traditional HTML forms are built and react to user input, because again, that's the underlying technology for all of these forms that come from frameworks. The end-to-end documentation for HTML and CSS, JavaScript, is really the standard guide for a lot of things, including for forms. So you can look at a lot of just plain HTML forms here and how they work. And a lot of things about how Angular forms work is going to be clarified by doing this. So highly recommended that you learn traditional HTML form development alongside your Angular studies. Just search MDN form and you'll find these pages. Before we dive into the code, let's look at how hero form responds and what its behavior. So here's a required field here, and if I delete it, you can see error pops up and stays there regardless of whether or not I'm visiting it. Name is required, and then if I type in new hero, then the error clears out. Alter ego is not a required field, so it being blank will not be an error there. And here's finally this drop-down menu here. So when we hit submit, normally that would submit to a server, this form, but in our case it just shows us what we're submitting here, the name, the alter ego, the power, and so forth. And we can edit that as well. Go back to the editing mode. We also have the new hero button, which cleans out the form, setting it to all blanks, like brand new, and then you can begin to enter hero information again from scratch. So that's how the code behaves. There's quite a lot to this. Let's get into it. Template-driven forms rely on directives defined in the forms module, and here we import it to allow our application to use directives from the forms module. Among the directives that we import from forms module are ng module, which allows two-way data binding. Two-way data binding allows us to react to changes that the user has made and do form validation in the moment. ng form directive creates a top-level form group instance and binds it to a form here, the HTML form, automatically bound to ng form by Angular. And finally, the ng model group directive, which creates and binds a form group instance to a DOM element. Each one of these form instances here, marked by these divs, it has the class form group. and has all the controls related to a single data entry item. Before we get into the details of the hero form component HTML file, let's take a look at the TypeScript file. We define an array of powers, which populates the combo box. We define an initial model, new hero, with these attributes, including the current power. We set submitted to false, and then on submit, we simply set submitted to true. And then on new hero, we have console log new hero clicked. Let's also take a look at the form CSS file, which styles our form. By setting border left pixel, we have the bands that our data input form has, for green for valid and red for invalid. And we'll see the various class changes that happen as the form evolves. These are calling out classes in the form in order to affect the CSS. That CSS is in turn imported in a normal HTML way through the style sheet link. Finally, let's take a look at the hero class here. So this has a constructor. Remember, TypeScript's clever constructor syntax allows you to both create data members as parameters as well into the constructor. So in Java, these would be separate. These would be declared as separate data members. In TypeScript, it allows us to compress that all into one statement. So the parameter sets the data member automatically, and the constructor body is empty. These are all public properties because we need to read and write them. This question mark indicates a nullable in TypeScript, so alter ego does not need to be provided in the constructor. Everything else is required. And finally, seeing how the form is displayed, we have app component.html, and that's its only selector. So that's the form that gets shown. And now we're ready to delve more into the template itself. The ng form, shown here, is the overall Angular directive that governs the form as a whole. Here, when we do #hero form, this gives us a template variable that acts as a reference for this overall controller of the form. So we can refer to that controller internally inside the form with hero form. The label is a standard HTML element, and the way it works is standard HTML for name. That gives it the label here, but that also ties it to the input that follows it. It's not because it follows it. It's because this for matches this ID here. Again, standard HTML. The type is text. The class is form control. The ID is name, and it's required. Here we have another template reference variable, #name, which links this control to the ng model. So this template reference variable name here and the two-way data binding ng model, as far as this input label control, is really the Angular addition to this. Next, we follow it with a div, since this is a required field, that hides if the name is valid or if the name is pristine. For example, if it's blank and the user has just seen the form, we don't want to display an error message. The class has to do with the styling of the error message, and then we put an appropriate error message within the div. Name is required. The next control on the screen is the alter ego form, and this is mostly just HTML5. We have the for the label and the type here, tying these two together via HTML5, and then we do have the two-way Angular binding. We don't need a template reference variable because the overall form is not monitoring this. It's not a required field, so it's not doing the things necessary to bring up the alert that's shown here. So both name.valid and name.pristine is something that we're going to see is monitored and controlled by ng form. The third control on the screen is a drop-down. It is required as well, so it needs to be tied to ng module through this template reference variable. #power. There's one piece of code I've added here, and that is this one-way data binding between the current model, piped to the JSON converter, and that accounts for this line here, which is quite nice to see because it shows how the JSON object model would be built according to the current settings of this form. Next, let's see how Angular controls this form through this ngForm directive that came from the Forms module. I'm going to right-click and inspect here, and then I'm also going to let's go full screen here. Pull this up. So I'm going to actually right-click on it again, inspect, and then hit refresh. So we see the initial setting of this class. You can see how Angular through ngForm and ngModel and the various controls that are monitoring this form and we've tied into it have initially set up the class. This allows Angular to maintain the state of this through the current classes, but also it allows us to style it through the classes. So we have form control that's untouched. That is, I selected this to be inspected and then I refresh the screen, so it's untouched. That is, it hasn't been visited yet by the user, and it's ng's pristine. Now you can see the value of those two things. You can tell both in code and Angular can tell this form is ng pristine and it hasn't been edited, and that it hasn't even been visited, that it's untouched. So if we visit it and then leave, we can see these controls changing, these classes changing. It's still ng pristine, but it has been touched. That is, it was visited but not edited. It still has ng valid set. So let's clear this. And now we see the change here. ng dirty, it's been edited, it's no longer untouched, and it's been touched, and it's ng invalid. So that settings that together allow this error to appear here. Name is required. So we have this, and now we have this alter ego as well. This is let's inspect this. So ng valid, ng touched. I'm visiting it, so it's been ng touched. I didn't hit refresh. Let's hit refreshed. And now we can see ng pristine and ng untouched as well. It'll never be invalid because it's not a required field. It's not monitored in that manner by Angular. Let's observe what happens when we hit the new hero button. So it clears out, and the console log new hero clicked is logged, but it also cleared out the form. Let's find out what happened. This click method actually has two methods. The new hero, which is simply a TypeScript method that did the console log. More interestingly, this hero form.reset. Where did hero form come from? Remember, that's our template reference variable back to ngForm. So ngForm is an Angular directive, which means it's actually an object that Angular creates that's part of the Forms module. So this is a method on that object reset, which clears our form. And then the button submit, you can see how it uses the hero form, also using the template reference variable form.valid. So it's disabled unless that's not valid. Back to our new hero form here, we see that ID is 18, name is null, power is null, alter ego is null. Now this is marked in red here because it's a required field that the style calls out. It's really using the border boundary on the left to turn this red, and red here as well because that is blank as well. Alter ego is not marked because it's not a required field, but notice we don't get the warning dialog popped up because this field is still pristine. That is, it hasn't been visited by the user. once it's been visited, then and is no longer pristine. So we typed in stuff, and then we've left it. Now it starts bothering the user about name is required because it's been visited and been edited and still wrong. All right. Okay, so that's an introduction to forms. A lot to learn, but I think I would characterize learning forms as being a short, sharp learning curve, but short. That is, I think it's masterable in some rigorous study in a month or two. Very critical for if you're thinking about Angular as a career, or really any front-end development work. Forms are really the bread and butter of that job. Forms and getting them to look nice with CSS. All right. Thank you so much.